So I want to talk a little bit about ideology in the first part of this video, and then we're going to move on to political parties. And this again, this isn't going to be on the test, but thus far I've been talking about ideology as if the whole world consists of liberals and moderates and conservatives, and it's actually more complicated than that. So I want you to understand a more complicated, a more nuanced way of thinking about ideology, but then we're going to move on from there. So I'm not really going to test you on this. I'm just trying to let you know that whenever I think it's important for you to know that, but that doesn't mean I want you to skip over this. Like, it doesn't mean I don't want you to watch it. I hope that doesn't mean to you, like, I guess it's not important. I do think it's important for you to have a better understanding of American government, politics, and everything. So we talked about economic policy, we talked about social policy, right? And when we're talking about liberals and we're talking about conservatives, it's pretty easy to think about the way liberals and conservatives are, because liberals, when it comes to economic policy, are liberal, and liberals, when it comes to social policy, are liberal. Likewise, conservatives on economic policy are conservative, and on social policy, conservatives are conservative. So there you have it, pretty basic. That makes a lot of sense. But there are two other categories that I want you guys to consider. One of them is a term that is actually well known, and that's libertarians. Now, here's the thing about libertarians. When it comes to economic policy, libertarians are conservative, very conservative. They believe in limited government in a really serious way, really limited government. When it comes to social policy, they're liberal. Again, in part because they think that the government should stay out of things. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Libertarianism is all like sort of based on this idea of liberty, that people should be able to do what they want to do, as long as they don't hurt anybody else. So as long as you're not interfering with anybody else and infringing on their liberty, then the government shouldn't place any restrictions on you. So if you talk to a libertarian and you say, should same-sex marriage be legal, they would say, of course it should. In fact, I don't even know why the government's involved in marriage at all. Right? If people want to get married, they can get married. If they don't, they don't. But the government has no say. But they certainly shouldn't be able to prohibit two people who are adults from getting married if it's consensual. If you ask a libertarian, should marijuana be legal? They would say, of course. The government shouldn't tell you what to put in your body. You put in your body what you want to. You have liberty. If you ask a libertarian, should heroin be legal? They say, yeah, same reasoning. You want to put poison into your body, go ahead and do it. But the government shouldn't tell you. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, people get addicted to heroin, then they're going to have to rob and steal to pay for their habit. And the libertarian would say, well, stealing shouldn't be legal, but what you decide to do with your own body, that's your own decision. Prostitution, sure, prostitution should be legal. Why? Because it's just a contract between two consensual, in theory, two consenting adults, right? Just like any other contract. Why would you get involved? Why would the government be involved? So libertarians are this mix between being conservative on economic policy. They think taxes should be really, really low. The government shouldn't take money from one group and give it to another. That's barbaric from the perspective of a libertarian. But on social policy, they're very liberal. Now, there's another group. I'm going to call them conservatarians. Now, here's the thing about conservatarians that you need to know before I explain what conservatarians believe. If you notice on your lecture notes, there's a red squiggly line under the word conservatarian. That's because it's not a real word. I've looked in many textbooks, and people have problems coming up with a name for this particular group of people. And so let me describe who they are. These are people who are liberal when it comes to economic policy, But when it comes to social policy, they're very conservative. And I've seen some books that call them like communitarians. I don't even remember what the textbook calls them. But I remember asking a student, well, students, a whole class, I said, somebody come up with a really good name for this group. And somebody said, how about conservatarians? And I really liked it. It's like symmetrical. You got liberals and conservatives, you got libertarians, you got conservatarians. So be careful using this word outside of this classroom because no one will know what you're talking about. But so, who falls into this category of conservatarian? I think a good example of this might be older African Americans who are very religious. When it comes to economic policy, they're just like typical liberals. They believe the government should be involved in redistributing the wealth, right? But when it comes to social policy, they're very conservative. They don't approve of same-sex marriage. They don't think abortion should be readily accessible, right? They have very strong religious beliefs. Now, this gives us 4 categories of people instead of 2 categories. Before we had liberals and conservatives, now we have liberals, conservatives, libertarians, and conservatarians, and then moderates are going to be a mix of all of these. So I just wanted to get beyond the idea that there's just 2 different ideologies. And with that, now we're going to finally move on from ideology to talking about political parties. Okay, so in terms of political parties, one of the things you need to know, and we're going to go back to the beginning, from the perspective of the framers of the Constitution, they did not like political parties. As a matter of fact, you won't find a mention of political parties anywhere in the Constitution. There are references to what we call political parties. They're referred to as factions. And the framers uniformly thought factions were bad. And the reason why is they were concerned, and you can decide if this sort of fits with your view of political parties. They were concerned that when factions formed, people who had a similar interests and they grouped together, that they would put the interests of the faction above the interests of the country. And so they were very worried about the existence of factions, but they didn't do anything to prohibit them from forming. They just expressed concern about it. As a matter of fact, in George Washington's farewell address, he talks about this and expresses concern about this. So, I mean, you can ask yourself, what do political parties, what are they really interested in? Are they interested in the betterment of the party? Or are they interested in the betterment of the nation? And I think probably everybody on some level sometimes worries that the framers had it right, that factions can be a problem in our system. But the reality is that a lot of our political system is organized around political parties. Our elections are, the way Congress is organized, as you'll find out, is around political parties. They're really important in our political system. So it's important to understand their function. So for the purpose of this remainder of this video, I'm just going to introduce sort of the idea of what political parties do. What do they do? The primary objective of any political party is to win elections. The goal of a political party is to take control of the government through elections, not rolling tanks out into the streets, but through competitive elections, taking control of the apparatus of the government. Ideally, they want to control the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. That's their primary goal, win elections. Now, their secondary goal is to carry out the policies that they promised to do. Now, I don't mean that in a bad way, that political parties, the only thing that they care about is winning, or the main thing they care about is winning. The thing is if you don't win, then you're not in power, and if you're not in power, you can't carry out any of the policies that you promised to carry out. And so winning has to be the primary objective, and it is. But I don't think it makes sense to think about that as a negative thing, especially if political parties, when they win elections, if they carry out the policies that they promise to carry out. And so as an introduction to political parties, I just want to get the idea that one, the framers were not happy with political parties. They were really worried about their impact. And that while political parties are in fact primarily interested in winning, that makes sense. That's logical. That's not a negative thing. You have to win in order to carry out the policies that your party wants to implement. Next, we're going to talk about political parties, but as in keeping with everything that I've talked about when I talked about the news media, when I talked about public opinion, I'm going to be looking at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to be looking at political parties as a vehicle that makes it easier for citizens to vote. I'm going to be looking at the way we process information and how political parties are essentially what we call an information shortcut that makes it easier for citizens to vote. But I'll pick that up in the next video.